Thank you, Dr. Cattery. Good morning, delegates. And Mitch and Ellen, you've done a terrific job of organizing another successful Congress here again. To you and your team, and to Kathy, thank you very much for all the hard work and effort that went into bringing this about. The theme is beautiful, because I'm so scary, my picture didn't even hit the program, so I'm at the right table. Well, it's an interesting time in the pharmaceutical industry in Canada, and for the past 12 years, it's been a lot of fun to roam around this continent in North America and look at some of the emerging trends. And by far and away, the biggest trend that is emerging now is the trend towards measuring and managing corporate culture. And why is that area of investment emerging as strongly as it is something I want to speak to now and give you some thinking around, is this a consideration for your organization, whether you run an organization in the industry, in the pharmaceutical industry, or whether you're part of the service sector. Size doesn't seem to be the determining factor. It seems to be more intent to perform and outperform your peer group that is driving the investments in corporate culture. A number of Canadian pharmaceutical companies are actually quite leading edge in this regard. Mike Tremblay and his team at Astellas Canada have done some very interesting pioneering work with working with their global counterparts to make a culture that works for the Canadian subsidiary. Glenn Block, who was here last year, is a member of the incoming class for the Hall of Fame, has moved on to the U.S. to run the neuroscience division for Merz. His division is making some significant investments in corporate culture. Alison Rosenthal at Otsuka, Canada and Montreal. And the Novo Nordisk people have done some very interesting global work, which is being championed and pioneered here in Canada by George Gilrain and a number of others. So it's coming to fruition, things that were talked about just 12 to 18 months ago. So let me give you some visibility to why it's happening. Many of you remember the Red Book, Good to Great. It was on everybody's desks when I opened my practice in 2003. Everybody was reading it. Everybody was trying to figure out how to replicate the results in their business. The separation factor between organizations like Walgreens and at the time Yahoo and a number of others was astounding. They weren't just slightly ahead of their peer groups, they were ahead of their peer groups for more than 13 years. So the effort that was made by Jim Collins and his group to understand why were they separating themselves, came down to these 7 factors. The most interesting emerging factor to me was the first factor. The principled leader, not the desk-banging Lee Iacocca type, but the more modest CEO who is leading on modesty and values. The sequel to that book was taken up by a gentleman named Raj Sisodia, and he published a book called Conscious Capitalism, which is now showing up on every CEO's desk that I venture into in North America in the life science industry. And the reason it's taking a lot of notice is that it continues to look at what separates great organizations over a long period of time. This book was written with the co-CEO of Whole Foods. If any of you have wandered into a Whole Foods like I do, because I'm a celiac and I've had to for years, you notice an immediate difference in the culture from the cashier all the way to the management team that you may interact with on a regular basis. Starbucks is the same. A lot of these companies are featured in this book. What makes them exceptional organizations? Why do they perform way above peer group? And why do they sustain that has a lot to do with actively managing their corporate culture. So the 3 key areas are defining the core values with stakeholders. Corporate culture should not be decided by a bunch of white-haired gentlemen sitting in a corner office. It needs to be decided with input from your stakeholders. And to Miriam's point in her presentation, a lot of this has to do with the evolution of the values of the people that you're serving in your organizations, including your employees, your customers, and your end users. Leading by example is by far and away the most important point I want to leave you with today. If you're running an organization, your values and how you behave have more to do with sustainability of corporate culture than anything else. If you walk the talk, you'll deliver a sustainable corporate culture. And I know Mike knows what I'm talking about. It's the same thing if you don't walk the talk. All the work you do on corporate culture will be destroyed and hypocrisy will shine through the minute you break that very important law. Measuring and managing has become a new phenomenon. A lot of people have published corporate culture documents, have put posters up on the wall, entries on their websites, only to find that they're not sustainable. Measuring and managing corporate culture now is as sustainable as looking at IMS data. It's as sustainable as looking at financial data, and it can be done. There's a number of providers that can serve you in this area. The Environics Group is actually our favorite go-to resource for providing you data to help measure and manage corporate culture. We'll speak to that now. So what drives the values chain in most organizations is really your values and the values of the organization, especially its leadership group. The values really drive your behaviors, and that is what defines culture. It also is the most significant factor when you're measuring employee engagement. Your level of engagement, the inverse of that is the amount of entropy in your values and your direct supervisor's values. So if you've ever worked for a boss that your values weren't aligned with, and I went through that experience on more than one occasion, you either find yourself accommodating those values and becoming somebody you're not comfortable with in your own skin, or you decide to leave an organization. 82% of employees leave an organization not for money. 82% of people leave organizations because of lack of coherence between their values and their direct supervisor. So paying attention to this drives employee engagement. And as you know, here in the pharmaceutical industry, most of our marketing mix takes place between frontline people and the physicians and clinics. If those people aren't being well led, if the culture is a toxic culture, that will show up in terms of the relationship you have with your customers and how engaged those customers are in prescribing your medicines or not. So pay attention to this issue. It is now becoming one of the top issues in terms of where strategic planning is going. I was with a client yesterday in Cambridge, and it's become their #1 strategic priority is to identify, measure, and manage their corporate culture going forward. So again, this is what is driving this moving forward. The values chain is something worth paying attention to. The #1 question pharmaceutical reps get asked when they walk into a physician's office is, what's new? And I would argue with you right now, what isn't new? There is so much happening, so much turbulence. The dynamics in this category are probably unforeseen. And I've never seen anything like it in my 30-some years in the industry. Things are changing in terms of corporate values, the models that are emerging in terms of some of the speakers you've heard already here this morning, not only in the Canadian market, but if you look at some of the big plays, my old shop at Allergan is going through a hostile takeover with Valiant, which nobody would have saw that coming 3 years ago. The organization I was with yesterday is starting an organization called Alphion, or they are partnering with them. It's an organization where the physicians will own the channel. They will own this company. And those physicians will decide which products get distributed and supported through their physician network. So we never would have imagined these things 3 years ago. It's important to pay attention to them. The corporate dynamics are not only changing because of some of the opportunities that people see financially that Brian Bloom talked about, but what are your corporate partners, what are your bosses and head office expecting from you? Well, things are pretty stable for about 240 years. Then all of a sudden the information age presented the microcomputer and things changed from there dramatically in terms of their expectations of you as a leader. It used to be, and it's still published in business books today. My son goes to the Molson School of Business in Montreal, and unfortunately, they still have a lot of this in their textbooks. And it's been outdated for probably close to 30 years. They still talk about budgeting, directing, controlling, maintaining, the stuff that we were taught when we entered the industry, what I was taught 30 years ago. What you see now in terms of best practices in this age, in the information age, is coaching is much more collaborative. Aligning, motivating, developing. You're no longer supervising the doing of things like the manufacturing of materials. What you're supervising is gone. What you need to lead now as a coach, as a leader in the organization, is you need to lead thinking. If your people aren't leaving your one-on-ones thinking at a higher level than when they entered your office, you're really not doing your jobs. So going forward, you have to be comfortable with this concept of transformational leadership rather than transactional leadership. It comes down with your ability to be emotionally intelligent and to be comfortable having conversation with your employees around things like values, life, and leadership. Coaching is going to come from the inside out. It's a much more rigorous and difficult discipline than it's ever been. There's no question there's enormous dynamics with the employees that you're leading. The values between the boomers, the Gen X, and Gen Y couldn't be more different, as all of you know. There's a lot more ethnic diversity in your workforce. There's a lot more gender diversity. This is changing everything. You're seeing changes in work ethic, tech savviness, the motive for working, focus, money, work style. We call it entitlement if we're boomers, but we better get used to it because it's not entitlement, it's quality of life. The second thing that we're seeing with employee dynamics is you can no longer just try to work with fear and incentive as your model for leadership. That's top down and outside in. It needs to come from the inside out. Those emotions, beliefs, and values are things we weren't comfortable or aren't comfortable talking about, you need to be comfortable talking about. The same thing with customer dynamics. It's exactly the same model. Your physicians are changing. It's no longer the white male European descent, mostly female, graduates from schools of medicine, very ethnically diverse, very different values from their counterparts. You have to be able to represent this, and actually some of the data that Environics has shared with you in some of their tools will help you gain insights in terms of their styles of communication and preferred methodologies. So I'm not going to give you all the details here, but in the handouts you have, you will see that there is a process that you should follow if you're serious about investing in your corporate culture. This is not a one-time event. If it's a one-time event, it's not worth the investment. It'll show up in a poster, it'll show up on your website, but it won't be sustainable. The corporate culture is the petri dish you create for your employees. What environment are they swimming in? What are they working in? What do you want to be working in? You have to pay attention because the ingredients that are in your petri dish are your values, your behaviors, and how do you walk the talk is probably the most important concept that we can give you insights. And there are ways to measure this. There are new tools coming from places like the Barrett Values people in the UK. Richard Barrett was Executive Vice President of the World Bank. He spent the last 15 years of his life trying to understand why culture matters. And he predicted the demise of a number of the economies around the world, like Iceland and Greece, based on the disconnect between the electorate and their leadership. And these. But if you want to get a 360 and you want to be able to use it to lead yourself more effectively or lead the organization more effectively, it should be values-based and based on what's driving your business. So we'll leave you with that model. If you have any questions, I'm available throughout the day. And again, thanks, Mitch and Alan, for the opportunity to share this insight with the delegates.